Welcome to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, land of plaid and coffee. This is David. I thought I was recording and I didn't, and I read all the way through. Yes, that happens sometimes. Anyways, welcome to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, land of plaid and coffee, and PacWest Bigfoot. And we're going to get into today's encounter story in just a second here. First and foremost, for those of you who have ordered anything from the PacWest Bigfoot shop, just to let you know, they are going to be shut down. They are based out of Detroit, Michigan, and they're going to be shut down for just a few weeks or so here. So as soon as they get back up and running, which they shall, your orders will be out to you. So thank you so very much for the patience and everything else. And if you want to go ahead and still place an order for now, go ahead, go ahead. Just note that it's going to take a little while before they're going to be back in there and processing those orders. Also, just want to say that I have allergies. I'm not ill. I don't have the virus. Actually, I just got some allergies, and they act up quite a bit this time of the year. So there you go. So if I cough or, try to fix myself, situate myself, just to let you know, that's the issue. So let's take a sip of the old iced tea. No coffee today. My wife makes that sweet tea just the way I like it. And we're going to get into today's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. And by the way, I'm going to try to do at least 2 or 3 a month for the next few months while we're all busy. Yeah. Bigfoot harasses boy in Redwoods back in 71. It was 1971 and my family and I were camping along the edges of the Redwood National Forest when I got the scare of my life. I literally saw a Bigfoot. Hi, my name is Jim, and I was mentioned by a friend named Bill who shared a bit of my encounter story in his. Dave, the one about the RV resort. Yeah. I was the guy that told him that what we heard that night was, in fact, a Bigfoot. And like them, I'd seen one. Well, more than one, actually. Here's my encounter story. Bigfoot, Redwoods, 1971. My wife and I met Bill and his wife that night, the night we all heard the screaming and howling, something I was all too familiar with. The wife and I were on a 2-week vacation from our jobs when I'd heard this thing for the second time in my life at that RV resort in Washington State. The first, however, was in the Redwood National Forest back in 1971, and I got more than sounds. It was the scariest day of my life. Way scarier than just hearing that thing from a distance. Although that night with Bill and his wife did bring back some of those memories and that familiar chill down my spine. That day I got a pretty close-up look at 2 Bigfoot. 3, really. But 2 I saw plain as day. Here's what happened that summer evening in the Redwoods back in 71. Camping in the woods. I was what they call today a tween, I suppose. I was 12 years old at the time of this run-in with Bigfoot. Literally, I was a month from being a teenager, I remember. Being from Central California at the time, my parents enjoyed getting away upstate to where the evergreen forests met the vast Pacific Ocean. As for me, well, I just enjoyed being out of the flat stretches of home and into the mountains of what is the Pacific Northwest. My parents owned a farm, a large one that they said could supply enough vegetables, son, to feed all San Francisco for a whole winter each year. It was a great farm and a business while it lasted. Today that same farm is owned by some foreign company. They were forced out, my parents that is, slowly by the state government. And if it sounds like I'm a little ticked off, well, I am still, even today. Those people are thieves. Personally, eventually, the wife and I got fed up with everything in California and moved to Idaho. We love it here. But beyond the politics, know this. Bigfoot is real, and there are groups and families of them out there, especially in the Redwood Forest. So, as I said before I jumped off the rail there for a moment, we were heading out for an annual camping trip to the Redwood National Forest and into an encounter I'd never, ever forget. Growling. We would be there for basically a week just outside of Hyuchi, along the Smith River. I am not sure, but I believe that old campground is gone. It no longer exists today. But it was great, at first. Being back there again after a long school year and a horrible season in Babe Ruth League. Well, I was ready for some fishing and running around the woods by then. I was not ready, however, for real-life Bigfoot. And to be honest, I did believe in them. I always believed they existed. But I only believed like most do. From afar. From the comfort of home. In a book. Or while visiting a state-controlled campground. Never did I think they lived and hung out around us so closely. The second night there, I would get a bit freaked out. And I know it was a Bigfoot. Maybe not at first, but I believe this encounter was a growl in the middle of the night. Then later, a howl or a scream. It was late, dark, and I had to pee something fierce. All those knee-high soda pops got to me. I had my own tent by that time, and old enough to be on the far side of that little campsite on my own little piece of dirt. But I was squirming for an hour before, and I could not stand it any longer. Of course, being as young as I was, the dark still had a certain amount of power over me. So yes, I was afraid of the dark to a point. Not at home, not even in Grandma and Grandpa's house, they said was haunted. But out here, in the woods and in the middle of these ancient and tallest trees in the world, well, that was a whole other feeling. There might have been a full moon out, but I can never tell with all those trees that hid its light. The fire was still burning, though. Not a roar like earlier, but it was flickering, so I had some light to see my way as I got up and walked to the tree line that surrounded the camp to relieve myself. I was peeing a stream when I thought I saw a flicker or a glint of light, a yellow-colored flash, if you will, out of the corner of my eye. It was eye shine. Again, that glint of light flashed and caught my attention real fast, and my heart started beating just as fast, too. I swear it was eye shine. Something up in a tree was staring at me. At least I thought it was up in a tree, as the eyes were pretty high up off the ground compared to me. I was, at that point, starting to get a bit scared, unsure of what was staring at me. As I finished up, I heard it. A growl. A low, guttural, and extremely scary growl. The eyes still stared at me, but I knew at that moment it was not a bird up in a tree. It was something else leaning against one. I didn't even zip up or pull up my pants. Instead, I turned and ran to my parents' tent, waking them up. And later that night, after my parents went back to sleep, I swear I heard a howl or a scream off in the distance. A couple of them, actually. Morning has broken. The next morning, after I crawled out of my parents' tent, awake and looking over my shoulder, back at the woods, my dad started telling me about black bears. They climb trees, especially here in the Redwoods. I knew this fact. At my age, biology was a class I had sat through in school that year. We actually started with mammals that previous September, and bears were a big part of that. I believed him, and my fears soon melted away with the sun that rose and shone through the trees as much as it could. By noon, I was back to fishing on my own and running around the edge of the ancient redwood forest. I still wrestled a bit in my mind for a couple of nights about what I'd seen and heard, but a bear was honestly the best answer. But the growl, however, that growl was nothing like I thought a bear would sound like, especially these small North American black bears. It was not a bear, I believe, later, and not much later either, just 2 days later. We decided to head into Crescent City that third day there and have some beach time and town time. I love that little place to this day. It reminds me of them, my mom and dad. They've been gone for some years now, but those days at the beach and the good ones in the Redwoods are still just as fresh in my mind as if it had all happened yesterday. We ended up walking through town and having a late lunch before heading back to camp. Across the street was a bookstore, and yes, I was a reader even then. So I asked if I could pick up the next in the Lord of the Rings series, if they had it. The answer, of course, was yes. My mother was a reader too. Must have gotten those genes from her. I found a copy, and I found something else. A large covered book, well, covered like thing, I don't know, whatever it was about Bigfoot by a gentleman named John Green. It was large, yellowish in color, and looked as though it was just recently typed up at home, stapled together, and sent to this particular bookstore. I asked and reluctantly was granted permission to add it to the stack of books we were to buy that day. I read that thing all the way back to camp and then took it down to the river with my pole, and there I sat reading about this giant of the woods. And this Mr. Green, who swears we're as real as a black bear or raccoon. It was not until I reached and read the part about some growling that suddenly the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I was starting to question again what it was I'd seen and heard 2 nights previous. I got back to camp and shared with my parents what Mr. Green was saying about this growling that Bigfoot do when bothered or trying to shoo away people from their area. My parents looked at each other and finally took a few minutes to explain why they believed there was no Bigfoot anywhere, and why folks like John Green sometimes write stuff like that for money and or attention, or both. They were wrong. Mr. Green was correct, and I would learn that the very next day. The nursery. I was still enjoying running around the forest paths and trails. Even back then, they were well marked where we were. Getting lost was only possible if you stayed or if you strayed off the trail too far. Unfortunately, guess what? I did. I was not lost, I suppose, but it took me a few minutes to figure out where I was and which way was north back to camp. Actually, I had to climb a tree to get a better look at where I was. I remembered a yellowish bush-like tree not that far back, so I looked for that color in the midst of all the green and shade. I found it about 40 yards back. However, I saw something else, something that had me stay right where I was. It was a massive and tall something or other moving through the trees and high shrubs, and it looked to be parallel to the game trail I had been on, or found myself on, and got lost on. But I don't know. It was not a bear. At first I thought it was. It was all on all fours, moving through the bushes slowly in my direction. It was not until it was almost directly under me that I would see exactly what it was. I was scared, and I was not moving. By the time it reached me, it stood up. Literally, it stood up on 2 legs, period, and was at least as tall as Wilt Chamberlain. I'm telling you, Dave, that thing was huge. I suddenly felt like screaming, but I didn't. I kept still and quiet, frozen in fear like a mouse 1 foot from a snake. It stood there for what seemed about 5 or so seconds looking around. And yes, it had little or no neck. As it looked around, it had to move its entire upper body. It was massive, as I said, tall, and the arms were long, and the whole thing covered in reddish-brown hair, much like the inside of redwood bark, that dark reddish color, you know. It finally moved on and disappeared into the brush. I could not hear it any longer, so I shimmied back down the tree and slowly and quietly headed back down the game trail to the main trail and back to the campsite. I did not make it back to the main trail before I heard those heavy footsteps behind me heading in my direction again. At that moment, I was even more freaked out and scared. I decided to scream after all. I let out the words, and I let it out good. "Get out of here!" That Bigfoot stopped. The footsteps came to a halt a second later after I screamed. I kept moving and walking up the game trail to the main trail. I came upon a familiar section or area. It was open to the west of me on the trail, pretty wide open for this particular forest, too. It was covered in fern and some low-lying shrubs and plants that led to a slope that led to a small creek or runoff. I stopped, but only because I heard again footfall. But it was not from behind me. It was from the edge of that open area. Mama bear. The Bigfoot was more brownish, or more brown or dark brown than reddish brown like the other, and she was a she. She was a female. How do I know, Dave? Well, she had breasts, and in her arms, cradled, I swear she had a baby Bigfoot. I could see a small face looking at me, or at least in my direction, as the mother walked quickly from one side of the edge of the clearing to the other and down into the creek and out of my line of sight. But I swear, I saw one, plain as day, and it was darker than the mother, peering out from underneath her large and hairy arms. That's what made it stand out so vibrantly. It's because of how black and dark it really was. I wish I could share more, but she moved so fast that all I could catch was a small face under her arms looking at me before she disappeared down into that creek. Then suddenly, and I'm telling you, my heart fell into my stomach, man. I knew I was not alone, and I was in immediate danger. I just felt it. And I was. The screaming behind me was louder than I could have ever hoped to scream myself. I bolted. By the time I hit the main trail, I was winded, but I would not stop. Not if it killed me, I thought at that time. Besides, that thing was still following me. I think even hurting me, or at the very least escorting me out of the area, and in a truly frightening manner. I started screaming once again, or at least yelling for my mom and dad. I think they heard me, or they heard that Bigfoot. Either way, I heard them yelling back. It was barely audible, but I knew it was them, and so I kept running, even faster at that point. Soon enough, the only footsteps and vocalizations I could hear were my own and my parents'. I was crying, exhausted, and literally fell into my mother's arms as I landed in them, coming around a bend in the trail. She said, my mother that is, that I immediately passed out. Long gone. My parents heard my scream, and they heard the scream of what they said was a mountain lion. They did not completely believe me when I told them what I saw. Later in life, after I graduated college, we talked about that day again, and I think they finally understood what I'd seen. And I had a feeling they had all along. They just did not want to see me embarrassed or made fun of for telling people what I really saw that day, I suppose. This is why that night with Bill and Susie in Washington, I knew what was screaming. I'd heard it before, that day in the Redwood Forest. But that is my encounter story. Thanks, Jim.